The amber glow of kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across the polished mahogany bar as Dora DuFran counted the evening's earnings. Her fingers, adorned with rings that caught the flickering light, moved with practiced precision through the stack of bills and coins. At 42, Dora possessed the kind of commanding presence that could silence a rowdy saloon with a single glance. Yet tonight, something weighed heavy on her mind as she listened to the familiar sounds of her establishment coming to life above her head. The Gem Theatre, as it was euphemistically known, stood as the most prosperous brothel in all of Deadwood, Dakota Territory. 3 stories of weathered wood and painted ladies. It attracted miners flush with gold dust, traveling businessmen, and even the occasional politician seeking discretion. Dora had built this empire from nothing, arriving in Deadwood 15 years ago with little more than determination and a keen understanding of what men wanted when they were far from home and civilization. She closed the ledger with a satisfying thud, the numbers telling their usual story of success. Yet as she looked around her office, with its expensive furnishings imported all the way from Chicago, Dora felt an inexplicable emptiness that prosperity couldn't fill. The photograph on her desk showed a younger woman holding a small child, but Dora's eyes quickly moved away from it, as they always did. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Ruby May, her youngest and most naive girl, with some trivial concern about a difficult customer. Instead, a man she had never seen before stepped into her office. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and hope in equal measure. His clothes marked him as a man of modest means, but there was something about his bearing that commanded respect. Most surprising of all, he wore the collar of a minister. "Mrs. DuFran," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent, "I am Reverend Samuel Hayes. I apologize for the late hour, but I have traveled a great distance to speak with you." Dora's hand instinctively moved to the derringer she kept in her desk drawer. Ministers didn't typically call on establishments like hers, especially not at 10 o'clock at night. "Reverend Hayes," she replied, her voice steady despite her wariness, "I'm afraid you might have the wrong address. The church is 3 blocks north." The man smiled, and Dora noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I assure you, I am exactly where I need to be. May I sit?" Against her better judgment, Dora nodded toward the chair across from her desk. Hayes settled himself with the careful movements of a man who had spent long hours in the saddle. He studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he were looking for something specific. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. DuFran, one that might seem unusual, given your current profession." Dora leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "If you're here to save my soul, Reverend, you're wasting both our time. I've made my peace with my choices." "I'm not here to judge you," Hayes said quietly. "I'm here because I need someone with your particular skills. Someone who knows how to run a business, manage difficult people, and make hard decisions. Someone who understands what it means to survive when the world has turned against you." The sincerity in his voice caught Dora off guard. She had expected condemnation, perhaps even threats about the town's growing temperance movement. Instead, this strange minister spoke to her as if he knew something about her that even she had forgotten. "What exactly are you proposing, Reverend?" Hayes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather portfolio. From it, he produced a deed and a bank draft that made Dora's eyes widen despite herself. The amount written there was more than she typically made in 6 months. "There is a property 20 miles north of here," he said, "a large house with extensive grounds. It was intended to be a home for orphaned children, but the previous administrator proved unsuitable. I need someone to take over the operation, someone who can provide these children with structure, discipline, and care." Dora stared at the documents, her mind reeling. "You want me to run an orphanage? I want you to give forgotten children the chance you never had," Hayes replied softly. Something in his words struck a chord deep in Dora's heart, a place she had walled off years ago. She looked up at the minister, seeing him clearly for the first time, and recognized something familiar in his weathered features. "Who are you, really, Samuel Hayes?" she whispered. "Someone who believes in second chances," he answered, "and someone who hopes you do too." Dora spent 3 sleepless nights turning Hayes's proposition over in her mind. The bank draft remained locked in her safe, but his words echoed through every quiet moment. She found herself watching the children who occasionally wandered past her establishment, their dirty faces and worn clothes telling stories of hardship she understood all too well. On the 4th morning, she summoned Ruby May to her office. The girl arrived with flour dusting her apron, having helped cook breakfast for the other women. At 19, Ruby May possessed an innocence that somehow survived, despite their harsh circumstances, and Dora had grown protective of her in ways that surprised them both. "Sit down, child," Dora said, gesturing to the familiar chair. "I need to tell you about something that might change everything." Ruby May's blue eyes widened with concern. "Are we in trouble? Did Sheriff Bradley say something about the new laws they're talking about?" Dora shook her head and carefully explained Hayes's visit, watching the girl's expression shift from confusion to amazement to something that looked almost like hope. When she finished, Ruby May sat in stunned silence for several moments. "You're really considering this?" Ruby May finally asked. "Leaving all of this to take care of orphans?" "I don't know," Dora admitted, vulnerability creeping into her voice. "Part of me thinks I'm losing my mind. Another part wonders if this might be the chance I've been waiting for without even knowing it." Ruby May leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if it's a trap? What if this reverend isn't who he says he is?" The same thought had plagued Dora's restless nights. "Then I'll handle it like I've handled everything else in my life," she replied. "But Ruby May, what if it's real? What if I could actually make a difference in those children's lives?" That afternoon, word of Dora's potential career change spread through Deadwood like wildfire. She hadn't even made a decision yet, but somehow the town's gossip network had learned of Hayes's visit. By evening, Martha Collins, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of Deadwood's respectable society, stood in Dora's parlor with 2 other women from the Temperance Committee. Martha's face was pinched with barely controlled indignation. "Surely you don't expect this community to allow a woman of your background to influence innocent children?" Dora felt her temper flare, but years of dealing with difficult customers had taught her to remain calm under pressure. "Mrs. Collins, I haven't made any decisions yet, but if I do choose to accept this opportunity, I assure you those children would be better cared for than they are now." "Better cared for?" Martha's voice rose shrilly. "By a woman who has spent years corrupting the moral fiber of this town. The very idea is preposterous." "And what exactly have you done for the orphaned children of this territory?" Dora asked quietly. "Besides organize committees to discuss how terrible their situation is." The question hit its mark, and Martha's face flushed red. "We are respectable women. We cannot be expected to soil ourselves with such direct involvement." That evening, after the delegation left, Dora found herself thinking about their words. They saw her as irredeemable, forever stained by her choices. But Hayes had seen something different, something worth investing in. The contradiction gnawed at her. She climbed the stairs to check on her girls, stopping at Ruby May's room. The young woman was sitting by her window, staring out at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" Dora asked softly. "About those children," Ruby May replied. "About what it might feel like to tuck them into bed at night instead of—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Instead of what we do here," Dora completed gently. Ruby May nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Miss Dora, maybe some chances are worth taking, even if they scare us." Standing there in the lamplight, surrounded by the life she had built, but increasingly questioned, Dora felt something shift inside her heart. Perhaps it was time to discover who she might become if she dared to leave who she had been behind. 2 days later, Dora made her decision. She sent word to Reverend Hayes through the telegraph office, accepting his proposition with one condition. Ruby May would come with her as her assistant. Hayes' response arrived within hours, agreeing to her terms and providing directions to the property. The news of her decision spread through Deadwood faster than a prairie fire. By noon, Sheriff Tom Bradley knocked on her door, his weathered face creased with concern. "Dora, you sure about this?" he asked, removing his hat as he entered her office. Tom had been one of her first customers 15 years ago, and over time, their relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on mutual respect and shared secrets. "As sure as I can be about anything, Tom," she replied, pouring him a whiskey from her private bottle. "Why? You think I'm making a mistake?" Tom accepted the glass and studied her carefully. "I think you're braver than most folks give you credit for, but I also know this town, and there are people who won't let you change your life without a fight." As if summoned by his words, angry voices erupted from the street outside. Dora moved to the window and saw a crowd gathering, led by Martha Collins and several prominent businessmen. Their faces were twisted with righteous indignation, and some carried hastily made signs reading, "Protect our children," and "No corruption in God's house." "Seems like the fight's already starting," Dora observed grimly. The crowd's chants grew louder, demanding she abandon her plans. Some shouted that a woman like her could never be trusted with innocent children. Others called for the territorial authorities to investigate Hayes and his mysterious funding. Ruby May appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "Miss Dora, they're saying terrible things. Maybe we should reconsider." Before Dora could respond, a rock shattered the front window of the establishment. The crowd's anger was escalating beyond mere words. Tom immediately stood, his hand moving to his revolver. "I'll disperse them," he said, but Dora placed a restraining hand on his arm. "No, Tom, let me handle this." Against both men's protests, Dora walked to the front door and stepped onto the wooden porch. The crowd's roar intensified when they saw her, but she stood perfectly still, her presence commanding attention despite the hostility. "You want to know why I'm doing this?" she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "Because I know what it feels like to be unwanted. I know what it's like when nobody believes you can be anything more than your worst moments." The crowd quieted slightly, surprised by her directness. "Those children need someone who understands that feeling," she continued, "someone who won't give up on them when they make mistakes. If you think your respectability matters more than their lives, then you've already failed them." Martha Collins stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. "You think pretty words can erase what you are? You think you can just decide to become respectable?" Dora met her gaze steadily. "I think those children deserve someone who will fight for them the way I've had to fight for everything in my life. If that offends your sensibilities, Mrs. Collins, perhaps you should ask yourself why you've never fought for them at all." The crowd's anger wavered, confused by her calm defiance. Some began to murmur among themselves, uncertainty replacing certainty, but Dora knew this was only the beginning of her battle for redemption. 3 weeks into her preparations for the transition, Dora received an unexpected visitor that would shatter everything she thought she knew about Samuel Hayes. She was in her office, reviewing the legal documents for the orphanage transfer, when Ruby May burst through the door without knocking. "Miss Dora, there's a woman here to see you. Says she knows about the Reverend." The woman who entered was elegant, despite her travel-worn appearance, with graying hair pinned severely back and eyes that held a familiar intensity. She introduced herself as Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes, and Dora's blood ran cold. "You're his wife," Dora said, not bothering to make it a question. "I was," Elizabeth replied, settling into the chair with practiced grace. "Samuel died 6 months ago in a mining accident outside Denver." The words hit Dora like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin as she struggled to process what she was hearing. "That's impossible. He was here. He offered me the position. He gave me money." Elizabeth reached into her handbag and withdrew a worn photograph. She placed it on Dora's desk, and Dora's world tilted on its axis. The image showed a younger Samuel Hayes standing beside a woman and a small child, But it was the child who made Dora's breath catch in her throat, a little girl with her own eyes, her own stubborn chin. "Her name was Sarah," Elizabeth said gently. "Your daughter." Dora's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. Memories she had buried deep began surfacing like bodies from a flooded grave. A young woman fleeing an abusive husband, pregnant and desperate. A man who had promised to help her, but had instead sold her child to strangers while she lay unconscious after a difficult birth. The years of searching, the dead ends, the slow acceptance that her daughter was lost forever. "Samuel never forgave himself for what his brother did to you," Elizabeth continued. "When he learned the truth about how you lost Sarah and how that loss led you to this life, he spent years trying to find a way to make amends." "His brother?" Dora whispered. "Marcus Hayes, the man who took your child and sold her to us. Samuel didn't learn the truth until years later, when Marcus confessed on his deathbed. Sarah grew up believing we were her parents, but Samuel knew she belonged to you." The photograph blurred as tears Dora hadn't shed in decades finally came. "Where is she now?" Elizabeth's face crumpled with grief. "Cholera took her 2 years ago. She was 23, married to a good man. She died thinking her mother had abandoned her." The revelation destroyed Dora's carefully constructed emotional walls. She had lived with the guilt of losing her child, building her empire on the foundation of that pain. Now she learned that everything, the separation, the years of not knowing, even her daughter's death, stemmed from one man's greed and another's delayed conscience. "The orphanage," Dora said through her tears, understanding flooding through her. "It was Sarah's idea, wasn't it?" Elizabeth nodded. "Before she died, she made Samuel promise to help children like herself, children separated from their families through cruelty or circumstance. He used our savings to buy the property and establish the fund. When his own death came so suddenly, I decided to honor both their wishes." "But why me? Why not run it yourself?" "Because Sarah asked him to find someone who understood loss the way she did. Someone who would fight for children the way no one fought for her." Elizabeth stood, smoothing her dress. "The choice is still yours, Mrs. DuFran, but now you know the whole truth." Sitting alone after Elizabeth left, Dora stared at the photograph of the daughter she would never hold again, understanding finally that some forms of redemption come through serving others rather than serving ourselves. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and by dawn, the entire population of Deadwood seemed to have gathered outside the modest courthouse. Word had spread about Elizabeth Hayes' revelations, twisting through the gossip mill until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. Some whispered that Dora was a grieving mother seeking redemption. Others claimed she was a fraud, trying to steal money meant for orphans. Dora sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing her finest black dress, the same one she had worn to conduct serious business negotiations. Beside her, Ruby May clutched a small Bible, her knuckles white with tension. Behind them, the gallery was packed with curious townspeople, including Martha Collins and her committee, who had arrived early to secure seats in the front section. Judge Harrison Morrison, a stern man in his 60s who had presided over territorial justice for 15 years, called the hearing to order. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as he reviewed the papers before him. "We are here to determine the suitability of Mrs. Dora DuFran to serve as administrator of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Home for Orphaned Children," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. Martha Collins's attorney, a young man named Peterson who had arrived from Rapid City specifically for this hearing, stood first. He painted a damning picture of Dora's past, calling witness after witness to testify about her establishment and its effect on the community's moral fiber. Each testimony felt like a blow, reducing her entire life to a series of shameful transactions. When Peterson called for Dora herself to take the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She walked slowly to the witness chair, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. The attorney's questions were relentless, designed to force her to admit her unworthiness for such a sacred responsibility. Mrs. DuFran, is it true that for 15 years you have operated a house of ill repute? Yes. And is it true that you have profited from the corruption of young women? Dora met his gaze steadily. I provided shelter and protection to women who had nowhere else to turn. In a world that offered them nothing but judgment, I gave them safety and income. Safety? Peterson's voice dripped with sarcasm. You call prostitution safety? I call survival by any means necessary safety. Dora replied firmly. These women came to me desperate, abandoned, and broken. I never forced anyone into anything they didn't choose for themselves. The courtroom murmured at her boldness. Peterson continued his attack, but with each question, Dora's responses revealed not just her past mistakes, but her profound understanding of desperation and the lengths people go to survive. When it came time for her own statement, Dora stood and faced the gallery. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she spoke about loss, about second chances, and about children who needed someone to fight for them. I am not asking you to forget what I've been, she said. I'm asking you to consider what I might become. Those children don't need a saint. They need someone who understands what it means to fall and find the strength to get back up. Then Ruby May surprised everyone by asking to speak. The young woman stood trembling but determined. Miss Dora saved my life, she said simply. When I had nothing and no one, she gave me hope. If she could see worth in someone like me, imagine what she could do for children who still have their whole lives ahead of them. The most unexpected moment came when Sheriff Bradley rose from the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, I'd like to speak on Mrs. DuFran's behalf. Judge Morrison nodded, and Tom walked to the front, his boots echoing in the silence. Dora DuFran is the strongest, most honest person I know. She's never lied to me, never broken her word, and never abandoned anyone who needed her help. These children would be lucky to have her. As closing arguments concluded, Dora closed her eyes and thought of Sarah, wondering if somewhere beyond this world her daughter was watching and hoping her mother would finally find the peace that had eluded them both. Judge Morrison deliberated for 2 hours that felt like an eternity. When court reconvened, the packed gallery held its collective breath as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Dora sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but Ruby May could see the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her nervousness. This case has forced me to examine not just the law, but the nature of redemption itself, Judge Morrison began, his weathered face grave. Mrs. DuFran, your past is undeniable, but so is your honesty about it. You have not sought to excuse or minimize your choices, which speaks to a character capable of growth. He paused, scanning the crowded courtroom. However, the welfare of orphaned children must be our primary consideration. After careful deliberation, I have decided to grant you provisional custody of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Home, with the following conditions. Dora's heart hammered against her ribs as he continued. You will undergo a 6-month probationary period, during which time you will be subject to monthly inspections by territorial authorities. Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes will serve as your advisor during this transition. Furthermore, you must demonstrate measurable improvements in the children's welfare, education, and general well-being. A mixture of cheers and protests erupted from the gallery. Martha Collins stood abruptly, her face flushed with indignation, but Judge Morrison's gavel quickly restored order. This decision is final, he declared. Court is adjourned. 3 months later, Dora stood on the wraparound porch of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Home, watching 7 children play in the yard. The 2-story house, painted white with green shutters, sat on 20 acres of rolling prairie dotted with wildflowers. It was nothing like the opulent interior of her former establishment, but it felt more like home than anywhere she had ever lived. Ruby May appeared beside her, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. At the orphanage, she had discovered a talent for cooking and had quickly become the children's favorite when mealtime arrived. Tommy's reading is improving, Ruby May reported with pride. And little Mary finally smiled yesterday when I taught her to braid wildflowers. Dora nodded, her eyes following 8-year-old Tommy as he helped 6-year-old Mary gather dandelions. Both children had arrived malnourished and fearful, but 3 months of consistent meals, gentle discipline, and patient affection had worked remarkable changes. "Miss Dora?" a small voice called from behind them. They turned to see Susan, a 10-year-old girl who had lost her parents to typhoid, holding a letter. "This came for you," Susan said, handing over the envelope with careful reverence. Dora recognized Elizabeth Hayes's handwriting immediately. Inside, she found not just a letter, but a small sketch drawn in a child's hand, a house surrounded by flowers with stick figures playing in the yard. "My dear Dora," Elizabeth had written, "I found this among Sarah's childhood belongings. She drew it when she was 12 and told me it was her dream of the perfect home for children who needed families. Looking at your progress reports and seeing how the children have flourished under your care, I believe she would be proud to know her dream became reality through your dedication." Tears blurred Dora's vision as she studied the simple drawing. The resemblance to their current situation was uncanny, as if Sarah had somehow envisioned this exact moment across the years. That evening, after the children were tucked into their beds with stories and gentle words, Dora sat in the parlor with the photograph of Sarah that now held a place of honor on the mantelpiece. She had finally found the peace that had eluded her for so many years, not through forgetting her past, but by transforming its pain into purpose. Ruby May joined her by the fireplace, settling into the rocking chair they had purchased for bedtime stories. "Do you ever miss it?" Ruby May asked quietly. "The old life, I mean." Dora considered the question seriously. "I miss the certainty of it sometimes. This is harder work than I ever imagined. Not the physical labor, but the emotional investment. When Tommy has nightmares or Mary refuses to eat, my heart breaks for them in ways I never expected." She paused, listening to the soft sounds of children sleeping safely above them. "But I've never felt more alive than I do when I see them heal," she continued. "When Susan laughs, or when little James finally trusts enough to ask for help with his arithmetic. They're teaching me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about using everything you've learned, even the painful lessons, to create something better." Outside, the Dakota wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Dora DuFran, once the most notorious woman in Deadwood, had finally come home, not to a place but to a purpose that gave meaning to every choice she had made and every choice yet to come.